The kitchen was dark, save for the faint glow of the refrigerator light and the screen of Eric's phone. He stared at the message again, its words sharp and vivid against the stillness of the night. I miss you. Can we talk? Karen. The name stirred memories he hadn't touched in months. He set the phone on the counter and poured himself a glass of water, the cold rush briefly grounding him before his thoughts drifted back to the beginning. It was a chance meeting. Business conferences were rarely memorable, but Karen had stood out the moment she walked into the room. Her laugh carried over the hum of dull conversations, her presence commanding without effort. Eric had noticed her immediately. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but there was something magnetic about her, the sharpness of her gaze, the way her words laced with confidence. They had first spoken over coffee during a break. What started as an offhand comment about the monotony of the speaker turned into a conversation that stretched far longer than either of them had intended. By the end of the day, Karen had become more than a passing face in the crowd. After that, there were emails, then lunches, then dinners. Each interaction felt charged, filled with an unspoken energy that neither acknowledged, but both understood. It was Karen who suggested, in her matter-of-fact way, that there was no harm in spending time together. After all, she reasoned, there was no rule against enjoying someone's company. Eric hadn't argued. At first, their meetings felt like a secret thrill, an escape from the humdrum predictability of his life. Karen's world was fast-paced and unpredictable, a stark contrast to the steady rhythm of his days at home. He thought of Helen then, her face blurred in his memory by routine. Their conversations had become transactional, revolving around schedules and tasks. The evenings that once felt intimate now passed in silence, punctuated by the occasional exchange of weary smiles. With Karen, there were no silences. She filled every moment with her energy, her laughter, her sharp wit. Eric found himself craving her company, the way she made the world feel bigger and brighter. He told himself it wasn't serious, that it was just a way to shake off the monotony. But then the boundaries blurred. Their dinners turned into late-night drives, their conversations into confessions, and eventually, their stolen moments into something much more dangerous. By the time Eric realized how far he'd fallen, it was too late. He leaned against the counter, the glass of water untouched in his hand. His mind lingered on the night Helen confronted him. It had been late, much like this. He had just returned home, his tie loosened, his briefcase abandoned by the door. Helen had been waiting for him in the kitchen, her face pale and set like stone. In her hand was his phone, its screen lit with a message that left no room for excuses. "I know," she had said, her voice low and trembling. Eric could still see the tears that had filled her eyes, the way her shoulders shook despite her effort to appear composed. The argument that followed was a blur of raised voices and broken trust, but one thing stood out clearly, the moment she told him to leave. "You can't stay here," she had said, her tone sharp with finality. "Not with me. Not with the boys." The sound of his suitcase dragging across the floor still echoed in his mind. He had left that night, walking out the door with the weight of her gaze on his back. In the silence of the kitchen now, Eric's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen but didn't reach for it. Instead, he stood there, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock. The memories felt distant, like echoes of a life that no longer belonged to him. But Karen's name, flashing on his phone, pulled those echoes closer. The apartment was small, but Karen had made it feel vibrant. Candles flickered on every surface, filling the air with the warm scent of vanilla. Soft jazz played in the background as she set a plate of pasta on the table, flashing Eric a radiant smile. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass of wine. Eric clinked his glass against hers, the sound delicate but final, like the closing of a door. His suitcase sat by the entrance, a stark reminder of the home he had left behind just hours ago. Karen was ecstatic. She floated around the apartment, humming to herself as she poured more wine and lit another candle. Her joy was infectious, her excitement a sharp contrast to the chaos he had just escaped. "You've done the right thing," she said, sitting across from him. Her hand brushed his, a deliberate, intimate gesture. "Now we can finally be ourselves. No more hiding." Eric nodded, taking another sip of his wine. Her words made sense. No more late-night excuses, no more sneaking around. For the first time in months, he could breathe without the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. The first few days in Karen's apartment felt like a dream. She was attentive, affectionate, and endlessly charming. Every morning, she brought him coffee in bed, her smile the first thing he saw when he opened his eyes. They spent their evenings talking about everything and nothing, their laughter filling the small space. Karen made him feel wanted in a way he hadn't felt in years. She praised him endlessly, his work, his wit, even the way he folded his shirts. "You're amazing," she would say, her voice dripping with admiration. "Helen never appreciated you the way I do." Eric didn't argue. He let himself be swept up in her world, a whirlwind of passion and spontaneity. Karen was everything Helen wasn't: bold, unpredictable, and utterly devoted to him. She planned romantic dinners, surprised him with small gifts, and filled their weekends with impromptu adventures. But as the weeks passed, cracks began to form in the perfect picture. It was subtle at first. Karen would ask about Helen, her tone light but probing. "She hasn't called you, has she? Not even to argue?" When Eric shook his head, Karen's smile would widen, her satisfaction barely concealed. "She's probably relieved," Karen said once, her laugh sharp and cold. "Now she can focus on the kids without worrying about you." The comment stung, though Eric couldn't explain why. He shrugged it off, telling himself it didn't matter. Helen had made it clear she didn't want him in her life anymore. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Was she angry? Hurt? Relieved? He thought of the boys, Henry and Lucas, their faces flashing in his mind. They hadn't said much during the argument, just watched silently as their mother told him to leave. Eric had tried calling them once since moving in with Karen. Henry had answered, his voice clipped and distant. "Hey, bud," Eric had said, trying to sound casual. "How's school?" "Fine," Henry replied. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Eric fumbled for something to say, but Henry cut him off. "Gotta go, Dad," he said abruptly. "Homework." The line went dead before Eric could respond. Karen found him staring at his phone later that evening, her brow furrowed in concern. "Don't let it get to you," she said, sliding onto the couch beside him. "Kids are resilient. They'll come around." But they didn't. Weeks turned into months, and the calls grew fewer and farther between. The gifts he sent went unopened, his texts unanswered. Each attempt to bridge the gap was met with silence, and with each rejection, the weight on his chest grew heavier. Karen tried to distract him, planning dinners and weekend trips. "This is our life now," she reminded him one evening, her fingers trailing down his arm. "It's just us. Isn't that enough?" Eric nodded, but the truth gnawed at the edges of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. One afternoon, while walking through the grocery store, he saw them, Helen and the boys. They were laughing, their heads bent together as they examined a carton of strawberries. Helen's face was brighter than he remembered, her laugh ringing out like a melody he hadn't heard in years. For a moment, Eric froze, caught between the instinct to approach and the crushing realization that he didn't belong there anymore. He watched as they moved through the aisles, their joy tangible, their world untouched by his absence. When Helen finally noticed him, her smile faltered. She offered a polite nod before turning back to the boys, her focus entirely on them. Eric left the store without buying anything, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. That evening, as Karen chatted about her day, Eric found himself barely listening. Her voice, once so captivating, now felt distant, almost hollow. and for the first time since leaving his home, Eric began to question what he had gained and what he had lost. The wine glasses clinked together, the laughter around the table loud and boisterous. Karen's friends were everything Eric had expected and nothing he could tolerate. Dressed in sharp suits and designer dresses, they exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance, each conversation dripping with subtle competition. "So, Eric," a man named Daniel leaned forward, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. "Karen tells us you're in finance. Good field, if you can survive in it. But I suppose it's less cutthroat than what we do." Eric forced a smile, gripping his glass tighter. Daniel had spent the better part of the evening boasting about his recent promotion, punctuating his stories with thinly veiled digs at anyone who wasn't hungry enough to make it. "Eric's brilliant at what he does," Karen chimed in, her tone cheerful but distant. "He's just a bit old-fashioned. Like stability. Old-fashioned." The word hit like a slap, though Eric kept his expression neutral. Karen's friends nodded, as though she had explained everything they needed to know about him. The conversation shifted to one of Karen's girlfriends, a woman named Amelia, who recounted a recent deal she had closed by exploiting a rival's mistake. The group erupted into applause, their admiration unsettling. "That's how it's done," Karen said, her smile wide. "You see an opportunity, and you take it. No room for sentiment." Eric studied her, the way her eyes gleamed as she leaned into the conversation. She looked completely at ease, absorbed in their world. For the first time, he saw her through their lens, ambitious, unapologetic, and willing to do whatever it took to succeed. It wasn't the Karen he thought he knew. By the time the evening ended, Eric felt drained. As they walked back to Karen's apartment, her arm looped through his, she looked up at him expectantly. "Well?" she asked. "What did you think of everyone?" "They're intense," he said carefully. Karen laughed. "They have to be. In our world, if you're not intense, you're invisible." Eric stopped walking, pulling his arm from hers. "I don't think that's the world I want to live in, Karen. They're," he searched for the right word, "ruthless. Everything is about winning, no matter the cost. That's not how I work." Karen sighed, her cheerful facade cracking. "Not everyone gets it, Eric. It's okay if you don't. But this is who I am. It's who we are now." Eric stared at her, realizing she meant every word. Later that night, as they sat in the living room, Eric couldn't keep his thoughts to himself any longer. "I miss the boys," he said quietly. Karen looked up from her phone, her brows furrowing. "Eric, we've talked about this. You have to give it time." "They're my kids, Karen. I can't just pretend they don't exist." Karen's irritation flared visibly. "No one's asking you to pretend, but obsessing over it doesn't help. They'll come around when they're ready. Until then, maybe focus on what you do have." She gestured to herself, her voice edged with impatience. Eric bit back a retort, knowing it would only lead to an argument, but her dismissive tone lingered, widening the growing chasm between them. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee, an envelope caught his eye on the table. Karen must have brought it in with the mail. It was a letter from Helen's lawyer. Eric opened it slowly, his hands trembling as he read the words. A court summons. Divorce proceedings. For a moment he just stared at the paper, the weight of it settling on his chest. Karen walked into the room, her cheerful morning demeanor faltering when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" Eric handed her the letter without a word. She scanned it quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Well," she said finally, "you knew this was coming." He didn't respond. He just sat there, staring out the window, the noise of the world around him fading into silence. The courtroom was sterile and impersonal, its beige walls and rows of wooden benches doing little to ease the tension in the air. Eric sat stiffly at his table, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on Helen as she entered the room. She looked radiant. Her hair, neatly styled, framed her face in soft waves. She wore a simple but elegant blouse and skirt, her posture exuding confidence. It was a sharp contrast to the last time he had seen her like this, years ago, at a work gala, where she had been the center of his attention. Now she barely glanced in his direction. As the judge began reading through the initial proceedings, Eric found himself unable to focus. His thoughts kept drifting to her calm demeanor, the way she sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression neutral but resolute. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked free. The session was brief, mostly procedural, but every word spoken felt like a chisel carving away at what remained of their life together. When it was over, Helen stood, thanked her lawyer, and began gathering her things. Eric approached her hesitantly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Helen," he said softly. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. There was no hostility there, just a cool politeness. "Eric," she replied. "Can we talk? Maybe over coffee?" he asked, gesturing toward the cafe across the street. For a moment, she seemed to consider it. Then she nodded. "All right." They sat at a corner table, the hum of conversation around them providing a buffer for the awkward silence. Helen ordered tea. Eric, coffee. "You look, well," he said, breaking the silence. "Thank you." She sipped her tea, her movements measured, deliberate. He paused, searching for the right words. "I wanted to say I'm sorry, for everything, for hurting you, for all of it." Helen's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Eric, I've already made my peace with it. What's done is done." Her tone was calm, almost detached, and it unsettled him. He had expected anger, resentment, maybe even a glimmer of regret. But she seemed untouched by the weight of their shared past. As the conversation continued, something shifted. The polite distance between them began to dissolve as they reminisced about their early years together. "Do you remember that tiny apartment we first rented?" Helen asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Eric chuckled. "How could I forget? The heater barely worked, and the pipes clanged every time we turned on the water." "And you insisted on fixing it yourself," Helen added, laughing softly. "You made it worse, if I recall." They talked about their wedding, the first time they saw Henry's tiny face in the hospital, the sleepless nights with Lucas, and the road trips where nothing ever went according to plan, but always ended with them laughing. For a brief moment, it felt like old times. As they walked out of the cafe, Eric hesitated. "Would you want to do this again sometime? Just talk, maybe over dinner?" Helen looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. "All right, but just as friends, Eric." "Of course," he said quickly, though the word stung. Their next meeting was at a quiet restaurant downtown. The conversation flowed easily, the weight of the courtroom forgotten. By the time the meal ended, neither of them seemed eager to leave. "Do you have time for a nightcap?" Eric asked as they walked toward the parking lot. Helen glanced at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. Then she nodded. "Sure." They found themselves in a small hotel bar, the dim lighting and soft music creating an intimate atmosphere. One drink turned into two, then three, and when Eric finally worked up the courage to reach for her hand, she didn't pull away. What happened next felt inevitable. The hotel room was modest, but it didn't matter. In the quiet moments that followed, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Eric felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Their meetings became more frequent after that. Dinner dates turned into evenings at hotels, stolen moments where they could forget everything else and just be. For Eric, these encounters reignited something he thought he had lost forever. Helen was still everything he loved, intelligent, kind, with a quiet strength that drew him in. Each time he saw her, he found himself hoping, praying, that the divorce wouldn't go through, that she might see what they still had and decide it was worth saving. But Helen remained elusive, her emotions carefully guarded. And every time he asked her about the future, she would smile softly and change the subject. For Eric, it was both exhilarating and torturous. The sound of Karen's voice carried through the apartment as Eric stepped inside, dropping his keys on the counter. She was on the phone, her tone sharp and insistent, words cutting through the air like knives. "I told her it's not my problem if she can't meet the deadline," Karen snapped, pacing the living room. She knew what she was signing up for. Eric sighed, walking past her to the kitchen. The constant edge in Karen's voice had become a staple of their life together. At first he had admired her ambition, her unapologetic drive to succeed. Now, it grated on him, every conversation tinged with a competitiveness that left no room for anything else. When Karen finally ended the call, she turned to him with a forced smile. "Hey, long day?" "Yeah," he replied, grabbing a glass of water. Karen tilted her head, her smile fading. "You didn't call, you know. I texted you earlier. Where were you?" "At work," Eric said, trying to keep his tone even. "And after?" she pressed. Eric frowned, setting the glass down. "I grabbed a coffee. Needed to clear my head." Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You could have told me. I've been sitting here wondering where you were." Eric resisted the urge to snap back. "Karen, do I really need to report every move I make?" Her expression hardened. "I'm not asking for a report. I'm asking for consideration. Is that so much?" Eric didn't respond. He walked past her to the bedroom, closing the door behind him. The walls of the apartment, once warm and inviting, now felt like they were closing in. Eric's phone buzzed on the nightstand the next morning, pulling him from a restless sleep. It was a message from Henry. "Hey, Dad. Got an A on my math test. Thought you'd want to know." A smile tugged at Eric's lips as he typed a quick reply, asking for details. Moments later, Henry called. "Hey, buddy," Eric said, his tone brighter than it had been in days. "Hi," Henry replied. His voice was less guarded than before, a small victory in Eric's mind. They talked for a while about school, sports, and Henry's friends. But when Eric cautiously brought up Helen, the warmth in Henry's tone evaporated. "Mom's fine," Henry said shortly. "What about—" "Dad, I gotta go," Henry interrupted. "Talk later, okay?" The call ended before Eric could say anything else. Lucas was the same. The rare moments he called were filled with updates about his classes or a funny story from school. But any mention of Helen was met with silence or a quick change of subject. It was maddening. Eric wanted to know more, to be part of their lives again. But every step forward felt like running into a brick wall. Helen, on the other hand, was an enigma. Their meetings had become less frequent, her once warm demeanor replaced by a polite distance. One evening after dinner, Eric tried to press her. "You've been busy lately," he said, keeping his tone light. "I have," she replied simply, sipping her wine. "With work?" Helen hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "And other things," she said finally. "What other things?" Eric asked, unable to keep the curiosity, or the irritation, out of his voice. Helen set her glass down, meeting his gaze evenly. "Eric, my life doesn't revolve around explaining everything to you anymore. We're not together." Her words hit harder than he expected. As the weeks went on, Eric noticed changes he couldn't ignore. Helen seemed more vibrant, her confidence growing with each passing day. She had new friends, people he didn't recognize, and plans she never elaborated on. Once, when he dropped by to see the boys, Helen was heading out. She was dressed in a way he hadn't seen in years, a sleek dress, her hair styled, a hint of perfume lingering in the air. "Big night?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Just meeting some friends," she replied, her tone neutral. Eric watched her leave, a mix of jealousy and frustration boiling inside him. He wanted to know where she was going, who she was seeing, but he had no right to ask. Karen noticed his distracted mood. You're thinking about her again, aren't you? She said one evening, her voice sharp. I'm thinking about my kids, Eric replied. Karen scoffed. No, you're thinking about Helen. Every time you get like this, it's because of her. You need to let it go, Eric. He didn't answer. Karen's words only fueled the simmering resentment inside him. One afternoon, Eric arrived home to find an envelope waiting for him. His name was neatly printed on the front, the sender's address unmistakably from Helen's lawyer. He opened it slowly, his heart sinking as he read the contents. It was a reminder of their next court date, another step toward finalizing the divorce. Karen walked into the room, her expression curious. What is it? Nothing, Eric said, slipping the papers back into the envelope. But it wasn't nothing. It was the final crack in a life that had already begun to fall apart. The courtroom felt colder this time, the sterile environment amplifying the emptiness Eric felt inside. He sat at his table, nervously tapping his fingers against the polished wood, his eyes fixed on the door. Any moment now, Helen would walk in, and he held onto a fragile hope that today might be different. When she entered, Eric's heart skipped a beat. Helen looked composed and confident, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that accentuated her natural grace. She acknowledged him with a brief nod before taking her seat. There was no hint of hesitation or doubt in her demeanor. The proceedings began, the judge reviewing the final terms of their divorce agreement. Eric listened numbly as the lawyers discussed the division of assets. He had agreed to let Helen keep the family home for the sake of the children. In return, he would retain ownership of the lake house and a fair portion of their savings. It was equitable, reasonable, even amicable. But fairness did little to soothe the ache in his chest. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, do you both agree to the terms as they've been presented? The judge asked, his gaze moving between them. I do, Helen replied firmly. Eric hesitated for a moment before echoing, I do. With a final rap of the gavel, it was done. The marriage of 15 years was officially dissolved. Afterward, as people filtered out of the courtroom, Eric approached Helen. Could we talk for a moment? He asked softly. She regarded him thoughtfully before nodding. All right. They stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The sun shone brightly, a stark contrast to the heaviness he felt. Helen, he began, searching for the right words. Are you sure this is what you want? We have so much history together, so much we've built. Can't we find a way to fix this? She looked at him with a mixture of kindness and resolve. Eric, I've given this a lot of thought. Our time apart has shown me that I can stand on my own, and I'm happy with where I am now. But we can be a family again, he implored. For the boys. For us. Helen sighed gently. We will always be a family in some way. You're the father of our children, and I want us to remain on good terms. But as for our marriage, I can't go back to that. Too much has happened. He looked down, the weight of her words pressing upon him. Is there anything I can do to change your mind? She reached out and touched his arm lightly. Eric, it's not about what you can do now. It's about what's already been done. Trust once broken isn't easily repaired. He swallowed hard. I understand. I don't want to lose you completely. You haven't, she assured him. We can still be friends. We can still share moments together, especially with the boys. But I need to move forward, and I think you do too. Eric nodded slowly, though his heart resisted. I suppose I just hoped. Helen offered a sympathetic smile. I know. But sometimes, the best thing we can do is accept what is and make the most of it. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city swirling around them. Finally, Helen checked her watch. I should go. The boys are expecting me. Of course, he said. Tell them I said hello? Why don't you tell them yourself, she suggested. Give them a call tonight. A small glimmer of hope flickered within him. I will. Thanks. As she walked away, Eric watched her blend into the crowd, a sense of finality settling over him. The reality was stark. He had lost his wife, and his family was forever changed. But as he stood there, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't give up. If friendship was all Helen was willing to offer, he would start there. He would prove himself trustworthy again, not through grand gestures, but through consistent actions. He would fight for his family, piece by piece, no matter how long it took. Eric took a deep breath and headed toward his car. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a clear sense of purpose. Karen's screaming echoed through the apartment, sharp and piercing. Her face was red, her mascara smudged from the tears that streamed down her cheeks. "You can't do this to me," she yelled, pacing frantically. "You think you can just leave and go back to that boring little life you had before? Is that what this is about? Helen." Eric stood by the door, his suitcase already packed. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind a dozen times, but none of those imagined scenarios had prepared him for the storm of emotions now erupting in front of him. "This isn't about Helen," he said firmly, though her name twisted something inside him. "This is about us, Karen. This isn't working anymore." "Not working?" Karen's voice cracked as she clutched at his arm. "You can't just walk away. After everything I've done for you, after everything we've been through." "Karen," he said, his tone soft but resolute. "This isn't healthy. For either of us." Her grip tightened, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "If you leave me, I'll—" She paused, her eyes wild. "I'll kill myself. I swear I will." Eric froze, her words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. He searched her face, looking for some trace of sincerity or manipulation. "You don't mean that," he said quietly. "Don't I?" She shot back, tears spilling over. "You think I can just go on without you? You think I'll let you leave me like this?" Eric closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself. "Karen, I care about you, but this isn't love. This isn't what either of us deserves." Her cries grew louder as he gently pried her fingers from his arm. Without another word, he picked up his suitcase and stepped out the door, closing it behind him. For a moment, he stood in the hallway, her sobs muffled by the thin walls. He felt a pang of guilt, but also a strange sense of relief. It was over. Eric's new apartment was small and unremarkable, a far cry from the home he once shared with Helen or the lavish space he had occupied with Karen. But it was his. The first few weeks were quiet, almost oppressively so. He spent his evenings alone, the silence broken only by the occasional call from his sons. At first, the conversations were brief, filled with the awkwardness of rebuilding a fractured relationship. But over time, things began to change. Henry called more often, sometimes just to share a funny story or vent about school. Lucas started asking for help with his homework, their phone calls stretching longer with each passing week. Eric took every opportunity to spend time with them, whether it was a weekend soccer game or a simple lunch. Slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble. Helen remained a constant but distant presence. She was polite during drop-offs and pickups with the boys, but their interactions were brief, almost perfunctory. It wasn't until a year later, during a particularly rainy afternoon, that things began to shift. Eric had arrived at her house to pick up Lucas from school when Helen opened the door, her expression softer than usual. "Do you mind coming in for a minute?" she asked. Surprised, Eric stepped inside. The living room was filled with the faint scent of lavender, a stack of books piled neatly on the coffee table. "I was hoping you could help me move some furniture," Helen said, gesturing to a heavy-looking bookshelf in the corner. "Of course," he replied, rolling up his sleeves. As they worked together, shifting and adjusting the shelf, Eric felt a familiar rhythm return, the unspoken ease of two people who once shared a life. From that day on, their interactions became more frequent. Helen began inviting him to family dinners with the boys. then to outings with mutual friends. She even asked him to join her on visits to her parents, where her father offered him a firm handshake, and her mother greeted him with a warm smile. Step by step, Eric felt himself being woven back into the fabric of their lives. One evening, after a family dinner, Helen walked him to the door. "Thank you for helping out today," she said, her voice light. "Of course," Eric replied. "Anytime." As he turned to leave, she hesitated. "Eric?" He looked back, his heart skipping a beat. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate the effort you've been making. With the boys, with everything." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that left him speechless. For the first time in a long while, Eric allowed himself to hope. Eric leaned against the kitchen counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. In his hand, his phone buzzed softly. A single message illuminated the screen. "I miss you. Can we talk? Karen." He stared at the message, his chest tightening. It had been so long since he'd seen her name appear on his screen, but now, instead of igniting a spark, it felt like a heavy chain trying to pull him backward. His thoughts drifted to Helen, to the countless conversations and moments that had brought them to this point. Convincing Helen to give him another chance had been the hardest thing he had ever done. She was cautious, protective of herself and the boys. The pain of his betrayal had left scars that didn't fade easily. "I don't think I can trust you again," she had said one evening, as they sat across from each other in her living room. Her voice had been calm, but her eyes betrayed the weight of her emotions. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," Eric had replied, "but I'll do whatever it takes to prove myself to you, to earn your trust back." Helen had studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "It's not just about trust, Eric. I've built a life without you. I've learned how to stand on my own. If we try this again, it has to be different. It can't just be about fixing the past. It has to be about building something better." Those words had stayed with him. Every step of the way, he had reminded himself that this wasn't about erasing what had happened, but about creating something new, something stronger. Now, standing in the kitchen, Eric knew with certainty that he had made the right choice. The message from Karen was nothing more than a shadow, a ghost of a life he no longer wanted. He opened his phone, hovered over the message for a moment, and then blocked her number. The weight lifted almost immediately, leaving him with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Eric turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs to their bedroom. Helen was already asleep, her hand resting gently on the curve of her belly. He slipped into bed beside her, the warmth of her presence grounding him. As he lay there, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. For her, for the boys, for the second chance he had been given. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent before settling back into sleep. Eric smiled, his mind already racing with plans. He would ask her to marry him again, this time with a vow to be the man she and the boys deserved. 6 months later, the house was alive with the sounds of Christmas. Laughter echoed through the halls as Henry and Lucas debated over the perfect spot for the star on the tree. Boxes of ornaments were scattered across the living room. Strands of tinsel draped haphazardly over the furniture. Helen stood in the kitchen, her belly round with their third child. She hummed softly as she stirred a pot of hot cocoa, the scent of cinnamon and chocolate filling the air. Eric watched her from the doorway, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and love. She caught his gaze and smiled, her eyes sparkling with the warmth that had always drawn him to her. "Are you just going to stand there? Or are you going to help?" she teased. "I'm admiring my handiwork," he said with a grin, stepping into the kitchen to wrap his arms around her. She laughed, leaning into him. "I'd say I did most of the work here," she replied, placing a hand on her belly. "Fair point," he conceded, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they joined the boys in the living room, Eric couldn't help but feel a profound sense of peace. The mistakes of the past were still there, etched into the fabric of their story, but they no longer defined him. This was his family, his home, his future. And as they gathered around the tree, the room bathed in the warm glow of twinkling lights, Eric knew that he had everything he needed.